All right. Hi, everybody. We're back again, Amy and Debbie. And this week we are talking about rest. And I am a mom of young kids, as I've mentioned in other videos. Rest is something that we are often talking about in our house, right? I think any parent of young kids, any parent, period, you had young kids at one time, and we all know how important sleep is to our kids. We know how important it is that they get the right amount of sleep. We know how important naps are at certain times and how important just taking a break is. And I think we can fall into the trap of thinking of rest as like purely practical and something we kind of grow out of the need for as we become adults. Now we don't need to rest as much because we can take care of ourselves. And so I think this week we're really hitting that rest thing hard. Right now, if you read anything online, secular psychologists and doctors, everyone is asking us to rest. Everyone is saying when your bodies are stressed, you need rest. In order to keep your immune system healthy, you need rest. So how do we bring that into the spiritual realm? That's what we're going to talk about this week. So Debbie, do you want to take us to God?
Yeah, it is very practical,
Mhm.
and so that's something we need to pay attention to. It's physically healthy, but God talks about rest from right at the beginning of Scripture. I mean, He puts it in the creation narrative, this idea of rest. And I found myself this week, as we were just working on this, really struck with what God says about rest. He gets to the seventh day of creation and he rests. And because he rests on that day, he calls that day, well, first of all, he blesses the day
Mhm.
and he calls it holy. Now, that isn't just about one day of the week is holy for itself, but it says because he rested, that's why it was that. And it made me I just kind of paused in my tracks because I've never really sat with that before for myself. Like, God lets us know that rest is a blessed and holy activity. Like, it's holy. And I just couldn't go on for a little while. I just kind of had to sit there and take it in. I'm like, what does that mean? And I thought, gosh, we don't often think of it as holy. We think of it as optional. We think of it as the necessary evil that we have to get to, and if we actually collapse, then we'll go for rest. Even kids are like, no, I'll fight it till the very end. So, but God says it's holy, and then he encourages us to rest. He makes it part of the rhythm of the nation Israel to have a Sabbath. And so what is that? What is the spiritual significance of that? I think two things kind of strike me in what that does for us as humans, besides just refresh our bodies, which is a good thing, is it humbles us. So it's like a humbling exercise, because it makes us stop and recognize and live into the fact that we can't do it all ourselves.
Yes.
And so the adage of, God helps those that help themselves is really not biblically true. God is very attentive to those that are humble and know that they have needs, that they can't do it all on their own, that they are just the creation, not the creator. And second, it's a trust exercise, because when we rest, it challenges us to trust that God is doing something when we're not. And you think about, if you just sit with that for a minute, you think about, wow, that has a lot of application in different areas where we don't want to rest. And so, like, how do we make rest like a rhythm? Like, how does that work out in our life? Like, what have you even found in your own situation?
Right. Well, and yeah, when you shared or brought to my attention the holy thing, it really changed my perspective too, because I think, again, I have a 5-year-old and 8-year-old. So rest is still very much their rest, I should say. Their rest is still very much a priority in our home, because they're still young enough that if they miss the rest they need, the world falls apart. So in that sense, I thought I'm pretty good at this, right? I've always been that mom that like put them to bed early and we're consistent and all those things. But when I shifted my perspective to that if rest is holy, if rest is a blessed activity, well, then I'm terrible at doing it for myself. And my husband and I are terrible at sort of building it into our daily rhythm. We make sure our kids get the sleep that they need, but the opportunity to sort of figure out, like, how does rest become a part of it? How do we build in those rhythms has been a real challenge for me during this quarantine time. Just that challenge of how do we make it so regular that it is expected and that we anticipate it. And I think that's what God gives us in scripture, right? He doesn't just say rest is good, so get it in when you can.
Yeah.
He gives us a rhythm. He says, on day 7, on year 7, he over and over again, he gives us that rhythm of work hard, do good work, rest, work hard, rest, over and over. And so we've been really challenged as a family now that we're home and that 23 and a half of our hours are spent inside our apartment. How do we make rest non-negotiable and expected? And some of that means not just good sleep. We were pretty good at good sleep before for our kids. For me, that means prioritizing my own sleep. But it also has turned into, okay, that means between the hours of 1 and 2, we are choosing something intentionally for rest. And that means when we are getting stressed, instead of jumping to something else they could do, it's, okay, let's sit down and let's read a book. Let's rest our bodies. Let's play with Play-Doh. Because rest isn't just sleep. Sometimes it's finding a way to let our brains rest. For kids, that's so important, which is why in the email that we sent out, we talk about fidgets and other things. Sometimes using our hands is the best way to actually rest our brains. And so we started to build in those rhythms. This morning, we had a rough morning at home. Everyone was bickering and arguing. And so it was sitting down. We have like kinetic sand bins, and it was playing with kinetic sand and listening to audiobooks. And those are rhythms of rest. Instead of jumping to something else that's crazy, we chose to sit and to rest and to reset and then jump back into something that was a little more active. And that has been such a shift in our home and such a blessing for us. But the challenge we still have is, how do we make sure we prioritize that, not just for our kids, but for ourselves? And I think that's what we're asking a lot of people to do this week.
Yes. I mean, this is what's so great about what God says is he doesn't need to rest, but he rested as an example. So if nothing else, as adults, we could say, look, we may not feel it, but we need to lead by example. Like, and if we enter into that, then we may actually feel how it helps. Right. They actually start experiencing it as God intends for us to experience it. So maybe if your kids are the only way in to like live an example for them, just use that as a reason right now until you start feeling the goodness for yourself of the activity. Yeah.
Well, and that's a huge point, because for us, if our kids are resting between 1 and 2, the best way for me to get them to consistently do that rest is if I'm resting too. And resting, they've grown out of naps. Sometimes they fall asleep, and that actually has happened more lately, more often with the being at home and the stress on their bodies. But often they read or they draw or they do something, and I discipline myself to not go clean something, to not do the dishes, to not do any number of things I could get done, but instead to sit down with a book, or to just one day I took a nap while they did it. And that has been the challenge, but that's the gift there, is when all of us rest at the same time and we all come out of that at the same time, the peace in our home is much, much greater. And the gift of rest is much, much clearer, I feel like. And so that has become, again, it's those rhythms. How do we make it a family rhythm, not just a 5-year-old rhythm, but all of us together?
I think that's really interesting that you say that, because there is that God blessed it. How do we experience that blessing? And I think part of what you're saying is how you've started to experience it as a family.
Right.
And if we start paying attention to that, then the spiritual significance starts to build in our awareness, and it starts to be meaningful. Oh, this might be what it feels like that God blessed rest. We may be, tasting that holiness of this rhythm that God set up for us. So we have this unique opportunity right now, because a lot of our activities have been canceled. We didn't even have to say no to them. They said no to us.
They're just gone.
but, but so we can play around with it. Maybe we can get in some rhythms of rest that we don't normally enjoy. We can pay attention to what those are doing to our family environment, to our hearts, to our spiritual connectedness with God. But this is an interesting season to think also about the future.
Yes. Well,
And,
I think that's key. You and I were talking about that the invitation here is that, like, you could quit anything you want right now. I think everything, you're right, everything quit on you. So the beauty is when things do start to resume, right, that's not going to happen for a while. Summer things have already begun to be canceled. And if they resume, it'll be very slow and very narrow at first, which means if your kids were involved in 5 different activities every week after school, this is your opportunity to figure out which of those are you going to cut from your schedule, which brings you joy and which contributes to that true and peaceful rest, and which just stresses you out if you're honest. And this is your chance for you to sit with it and bring it before God and let him, you have all the time to rest and think and try to listen to what he's saying to you about it. Mm-hmm. Bring it before your kids, bring it before your spouse, and just let these things sort of lay open. And I would encourage everyone to really put everything on the table and decide that nothing is set in stone. And we're going to take this opportunity to evaluate everything. Yeah. So obviously big things like church is non-negotiable. School is non-negotiable. Like those things are going to get back in. But for all the extra stuff, let's see how building a rhythm of rest influences the decisions we make about all those things. Because we add things, we don't usually add them all at once, right? And so we've added those things over the course of years, like, oh, I'll pick up soccer this year. Oh, I'll pick up piano now. Now that they're all just kind of here, let's see how they work together and see what we need to drop before we move into that resumed schedule.
Yes, and it also gives us an opportunity to establish some habits as a family of talking with God about those things, so that before we add a new thing in the future, we pause for a minute and we say, will this fit? Is there something maybe we need to drop off in order to add this? And we're evaluating that stuff, not just from is this a good activity, but does this fit into the whole rhythm of what God is calling us to do as a family to continue to honor the rest that he calls holy. Mm-hmm. So cool. There's lots of ideas for them in the email and on our website. And so I'm excited. I'm going to continue to think, I know for myself, about this idea of rest being holy and how I really live into that in my own life.
Absolutely.
So, cool. All right, guys. Well, rest.